First of all, I would like to thank the Jakob-Fugger-Zentrum for the gracious invitation that I got sometime last year, and I really had no option except saying yes to the invitation. And I'm very happy to be here. I would like to thank the Dean, Thomas, with whom I do share intellectual interest insofar as matters theological and political are concerned, and of course Professor Kell, who introduced me. I would also like to thank Andrea, who picked me up at the airport yesterday and has been extremely generous with her time. I have prepared for this talk a written text of an academic caliber, which means with all the references, all the citations. But believe me, I won't inflict it upon you. I will speak to the text and hopefully in a way that doesn't send you immediately to sleep. It seems to me that perhaps more than at any other time in our modern history, it seems to me that this is we are going through an epoch of, let's just call it fantasies. Many fantasies. Our epoch, one of its features is the accelerated production of myths and fantasies of all kinds. And this acceleration of the production of myths and fantasies is made possible in a large part by the democratic access we all enjoy today in relation to new technologies. So in fact, we can go as far as to suggest that the more technological our societies become, the more they are capable of producing myths. And therefore, the more they are somewhat enchanted with the irrational. One such fantasy, which is, if not typical of our times, at least which manifests itself in new and virulent ways, one such fantasy is the fantasy of total security. It's the fantasy of perfectly controlled and tightened borders. Borders of all kinds. Not simply physical borders, but also borders of our own body, borders of kinship, borders of community, many different kinds of borders, tightened and closed. And this fantasy of perfectly controlled or tightened borders, it seems to me, is the manifestation of a dream, the dream of impenetrable and unsurmountable limits, a dream which is the same thing as the dream, if you want to use a philosophical concept, the dream of a domain without an outside. A domain which is sufficient to itself, which doesn't need any outside to exist in the way in which it exists. So it's a dream of separation from all that which is not us. A domain without an outside can also be understood as a domain whose walls cannot be broken through, and of course a domain whose boundaries can never be crossed. Why? Because they are continuously redrawn, they are continuously displaced, and they are continually pushed back to the point where, in fact, they are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So it seems to me that this is a very important feature of the times we live in, not only in the West, but everywhere else, including in South Africa, where I have been living and have been working. So, as the twin logic of order and security, because the two always go together, and freedom and movement, as they confront one another, borders almost everywhere are increasingly found in unexpected places. Not so long ago, I went to Dakar. My friend Joachim he was there, and he just came back this morning. He went to attend the Biennale of the Arts in Dakar, and from the report he gave me, he had a fantastic time. So if you ever happen to have the opportunity to go to Dakar, don't hesitate. So I was in Dakar, and in Dakar, which is a really vibrant city, extremely attuned to the arts, very urbane, cosmopolitan. This is a city that is located not far from a small island, which is called Gorée Island. So to go from Dakar to Gorée Island, you have to cross the little distance of the ocean. Gorée was a slave trade post long time ago. So I was in Dakar, and a friend who lives in Gorée, who owns a cultural center there, invited me to go and see him. And as we landed on Gorée, I saw patrolling the waters a Spanish vessel. So I asked my friend, but what are the Spanish border guards are doing on African waters? And he told me that Senegal had, in fact, signed an agreement with Spain, which allows, indeed, border guards from Spain and some other European countries to police the waters along the Atlantic Ocean border of Senegal, in order to make sure that would-be migrants don't even leave Senegal. So we keep them where they are. They shouldn't be able to leave. So this tells you the extent to which, in fact, what we take for the borders of Europe today are, in fact, extended constantly. They are pliable, they are flexible, they are not just the physical geographical borders we know of. They can be met, including in places where we do not expect to meet them. So the border as an institution is undergoing a process of metamorphosis, the features of which I will say one or two things as we go along. It wasn't always like that. It was not always that borders would move, if you want, that borders were in motion. It's not simply goods, people, or ideas who are in motion, but that borders as institutions are themselves involved in that movement. It was not always like that. In fact, it not so long a distant past, borders were, of course, always involved in the generation of new modes of power, and more importantly, new political reason. Such was the case, for instance, in 1889, 1884, 1885, when the Western powers met in Berlin for what was then known as the Congo Conference. 14 European powers met, and they divided Africa among them for the purpose of colonization. This they did by carving out the entire continent and by superimposing on pre-existing political entities and cultures a hodgepodge of geometric boundaries that divided it into the 50 countries we have today. I don't have a map of Africa here, but after the lecture, you can, those of you who are curious, you can have a look at the map of the continent. You will find really crazy borders. Some of them are just, you sit and then you make a big line. For instance, the border between Algeria and Mali is just a really straight line that goes from the top to the bottom. The same thing of the border between Angola and Botswana. So you have aberrant borders like that don't respect anything related either to a river, a mountain. You just divide the entire, carve it out. And if you read the General Act of the Conference, this was all, and I quote, in the name of free trade and civilization. And the motif of free trade as the equal of civilization is very typical of the ideological discourse in those years, late 18th century, early mid-19th century. Everything relating to places far away from Europe is legitimated on the basis of these two principles: free trade and civilization. Civilization encompassing, of course, Christianization. Because Christianization, converting pagan cultures into Christianity, was part of that package. It came with the package. Borders here are established for the purpose of expanding the spheres of free trade and civilization. And the argument I would like to make is that, in fact, in instituting a border, what it is that we institute is a new form of political reason. What we do when we institute a border is a claim we make in relation to a territory. At the beginning, in any case, at least in our own colonial experience, the raison d'etre of the border is to attend to the modes of populating the earth, the modes of distribution of the earth. A border in a colonial context such as the one I'm describing is a response to a whole set of questions which were prevalent then but which are still with us. What are these key questions? One is, to whom does the earth belong? When we say a border, we are responding to that question. To whom is it that the earth belongs? Who can lay what type of claim to what part of the earth? To whom should be allotted what share? And who determines its distribution or partition? That's what borders are for. Borders are a response to the question of the redistribution of the earth and who has the right to inhabit what part of it. At least if we look at the history of borders under colonialism, this is the conclusion, the first conclusion we draw from such a proper examination of that history. So, borders yesterday used to manifest themselves, of course, as tangible features, physical, located at the edge of state territory, sites of discretionary sovereign decisions, decisions made in relation to whether to permit or to exclude, what, whom, and under what terms. Nowadays, as I was arguing a minute ago, they are ever more mobile, they are ever more differentiated, they are ever more dispersed and fractalized, just as they remain contested. So that's the first set of comments I wanted to make. Now, I would like to move to a second set of remarks, which have to do with the fact that nowadays, the number of people on the move has never been so big, has never been so huge, and as more and more people find themselves on the move, new laws, regulations, bureaucracies, and procedures are produced in a renewed attempt at controlling and regulating their movements through and across the borderscapes of our world, and also in an effort at setting the terms under which foreign bodies might enter. And when I say foreign bodies, I mean those bodies. A foreign body is that body that is not mine, and that's how I should define it. A foreign body is a body that is not mine. So we see a multiplication everywhere, and I don't mean only in Europe, of laws, bureaucracies, assemblages, the aim of which is to regulate the terms under which we might allow among ourselves those bodies that are not ours, or at least presumed to not be ours. Whether they might enter, whether they might reside, whether they might work, settle, and perhaps integrate in countries other than their own. So in that sense, what we have witnessed, especially since the last quarter of the 20th century, and now in an accelerated way, what we have witnessed is the formulation everywhere of new migration policies, which are mostly about the control of human mobility, which are, once again, a key index of sovereignty in a world which is described both as a world of flows, but more importantly and increasingly as a world of risks and threats. So I would like to say one or two words about those concepts of security, risks, and threats, which have become the key language of contemporary forms of governance, including within Western liberal democracies. There's not one single democracy today that doesn't refer to those concepts of risks, of threats, and security in order to legitimize their actions. And this in response to an increasing demand for protection. That we live in societies where, indeed, a lot of people want to be protected. A lot of people want to be safe. And a lot of people believe that the world in which they live has become insecure, and they request security. So demand for protection and security, which in some instances is equivalent, not all the time, but in some instances is equivalent to a demand for repression. So the belief is that there is no security concept that is thinkable without adequate technologies. That's something new. It was not always like that. This is new, that in fact, security, we will enjoy security if we put in place and mobilize and rely on a whole set of adequate technologies that will protect us from threats. Examples of such technologies include tracking and tracing systems, especially for the security of maritime and land borders, but also tracking and tracing systems of those people who might be dangerous for our existence. Examples of such technologies also include explosives detection and identification capabilities for the protection of critical infrastructures and especially urban transport networks. They include things like vaporizers or vaccines and sensors for disaster management. There's a whole range of such new technologies, the aim of which is to ensure security and safety. In what is increasingly described as a changing threat environment, and in turn, this changing threat environment functions as an important impetus for market development. In other words, security threats also represent business and trade opportunities. There is no security threat that is not, at the same time, a security market. Not so long ago, distinctions used to be made between external and internal security and between civil and private security. For instance, the private security sector used to supply equipment for protection against indigenous threats, including things like physical access to access control, intrusion detection, CCTV and video surveillance. That was the case yesterday. Part of what has changed is that security governance today is mostly characterized by its orientation toward preemption. So it's a preemptive security mode whose aim is to address itself to threats that are deemed irregular, incalculable, and in important ways unpredictable. So in the mind of our times, if you want, we know that some of the threats are irregular in the sense that they don't happen continuously. We are threatened by this today, and then we are threatened by something else tomorrow, and so forth and so on, which might return, let's say, in a month or in a year. They are irregular. They are incalculable in the sense that we can't really put a number on them. We cannot, in a sense, predict neither the form or the nature or the consequences they will entail. And yet we keep trying to predict. So the preemptive security governance, which is dominating our debates today on security, aim to act against a threat whose actual occurrence remains irreducibly speculative. What I mean by that is that when I say threat and security markets are markets on speculation. And markets on speculation, speculative markets, believe me, are one of the dominant features of contemporary capitalism. The financialization of the capitalist economy rests to a large extent on speculation. Speculation on futures, speculation on risks, and so forth and so on. If you want to make huge amounts of money today, you invest in those markets. And I'm trying to make the argument that, in fact, the discourse on security is not just an ideological discourse, and it has a connection, part of what gives it its impetus, and part of what underpins the renewed infatuation with borders worldwide today, has to do with business opportunities, if you want to speak in vulgar language. That there is a political economy attached to contemporary transformations of the capitalist system, which relies on or gives impetus to the need to have borders. That this is not a need that is quintessential to us, or ontological, to use a philosophical term. It is produced as part of these new commodities capitalism is investing in. I'll give you a few figures, if I can find them. Just one little second. And sometimes we write notes and we can't read our own notes. I have found them. You know that the global security market, it has grown nearly tenfold from 10 billion euros, I'm talking about Europe, I'm not even bringing in the US. Europe alone, 10 billion euros to a size of 100 billion euros, and that was 7 years ago, in 2011. In 2018, the size of the security market in Europe is of the order of 220 billion a year. Meanwhile, the global demand for security equipment was projected to grow by 5% annually since 2012. In fact, it has grown by 8.5% since then. And by 2007 and 2013, the EU itself had invested 1.4 billion euros for research and development of civil applications of security technology. That was in 2013. Last year, the figure was 2.8 billion euros. So, the new investment in borders and the attendant war on migrants is a key dimension, I think, of the emergence of these new security markets in Europe and elsewhere. So that's a pretty straightforward argument I wanted to make. Now, let me move on and comment, and that's the third point, comment somewhat on, let's say, the ways in which the the new global mobility regime has, let's say, recalibrated our understandings of the body, especially of our understanding of that body that is not mine. As you know, a huge set of practices to control movement has been devised, especially since the last quarter of the 20th century. For instance, almost everywhere we have seen an increase in the recruitment of more border guards and seaborne patrols. Such has also been the case of, I have suggested it a moment ago, massive investments in new technologies such as motion sensors, surveillance systems, drone cameras, thermal imaging, technologies designed to monitor more comprehensively events within state space, at the edge of territories or beyond, as I told you in relation to Gorée Island. So, as a consequence of this renewed political, military and affective investment in borders, sovereignty increasingly consists in border work. And border work, in turn, requires the institution of various assemblages of multiple actors. States, transnational webs of security agencies, public authorities, private corporations, humanitarian organizations. If you go to any major border in the world today, that is what you find. You don't simply find states, state bureaucracies, you find all these assemblage of agencies and institutions, both public and private, some involved in so-called humanitarian work, the ambiguities of which we have to speak about, and others involved in profit-making. That's what a border is today. It's a concatenation of multiple interests, both private, public, and not-for-profit, for that matter. So, an entire novel migration regime is therefore emerging, and one feature of this new migration regime is that it requires a non-linear understanding of territory. Non-linear understanding of territory in the sense that in this new geography, old demarcations such as inside and outside, such as land and sea, land and air, those old demarcations no longer obtain. In fact, what is going on is that the techniques and technologies which were used to police the sea are now transplanted on land. If you want me to formulate it in one sentence, that is part of what is going on. Huge part of what is going on is that we have escaped, for those of you who are interested in theoretical work, the kind of dichotomy Carl Schmitt used to establish between land and sea. For him, these were two broad geopolitical spaces. Now, in the new border regime, which is typical of the new age of capitalism, such a distinction does no longer obtain, nor the distinction between the inside and the outside, the seas and the air, All of these categories are now recognized as fully imbricated. And this has a consequence of this is that the inside can now be outside, the sea on land, the land on sea, and what we used to take as close can be far away, just as what we used to take as far away is nowadays closer and closer to us. So we have a recalibration, a spatial recalibration, which is planetary, which is no longer entirely national, because, and I go back to part of what I was arguing at the beginning, because, in fact, part of what we are witnessing is a new cycle of repeopling of the planet. So the old model of sovereignty described by Max Weber, sovereignty over people, over taxes, over discrete territories, has shown its limitation. And in a world of technology-enabled flows, which is ours, many governments, especially in the North, have understood that in order to govern the movement of people across borders, it is absolutely crucial to first classify them. So this question of classification is back with us. You remember it was a key, both epistemological and political question in the 18th, 17th, 18th century in particular, and early 19th. Who is whom? Who belongs to what species? How is it that we distinguish one species from another? How do we establish a hierarchy between species? That was the question of classification. We thought we had escaped classification. The argument I'm making is that, in fact, no. Classification, the politics of classifying, is back. It is back, this time buttressed by powerful technologies, some of which are characterized by their velocity, and some of which manifest an intelligence capacity that by far exceeds human capacity. So classification in the 19th century is no longer the same thing as classification in the age of nanotechnologies. You can see the possibilities, let's say the effects this change in scale can entail, and borders are a manifestation of this renewed investment in the politics of classification. Now, how is it that this is done? Today, one of the most efficient ways to achieve such a goal is through the harvesting and strategic use of electronic personal data. And the purpose of classification is, in fact, to bring back bodies turned into information. That is, to turn a body into information and into a code, to bring all of that into a zone of calculation and manageability. So that is part of what is going on. That is part of the new regime of management of human mobility. That is the reason why bordering practices are everywhere digitized. They are digitized through the automation of data collection and of data analysis. What is it that is collected? Genetic information, collected, stored in electronic form, in searchable data. What else is collected? Physiological features, not all of them, but those which are unique to individuals, such as fingerprints, such as patterns of the iris, the retina, even the veins of the hand, physiognomic features such as voice, patterns. All of that is transformed then via algorithmic features, via algorithms, to produce what is called templates. And these templates are stored usually in centralized databases that are accessed when on following occasions the finger, hand, face, eye or voice is presented to the system. And after a similar algorithmic transformation of this biometric image, a comparison can be executed. So we are involved, to put it simply, in a massive production of biometric images that each of us, the purpose is to turn each individual inhabitant of the planet into a biometric image. That's part of what is going on. It's intensifying in places such as Africa and India. In South Africa, for instance, now, identity is a biometric identity in all senses of the term. Identity, you exist from the moment you are turned into information and a code. And in a few years' time, if you are not turned into information and code, you will not exist. You won't be able to go to school, you won't be able to open a bank account, you will have disappeared. You will have a body, but as long as that body is not immaterialized, you are not a citizen, meaning you cannot make any claim to any kind of right. You are stateless. Not in the sense Anna Arendt spoke about it, but in a new sense and in an entirely different technological environment. So borders, the argument is that borders are just, in fact, part of that broader process of which we cannot lose sight of. It might be also the case that templates that is not you, I mean, it's you somewhat, but you only exist through a template. Your template is what has to be recognized and is what counts as known to the system. And it may also be the case that templates are not stored centrally, but on a chip that is inserted on either a passport, which is already the case, or on a bank card, and so forth and so on. Basically, the turning of individual bodies into doubles. So you have a material double, a material part of yours, which, I mean, we can touch, we can, and then another part of the double, which is, how should I say it, which is nano in the sense is very, very small. It can be inserted, can travel. It is, the whole division between the body and the soul takes an entirely different shape in the current technological conditions. So in this context, to classify, as I say, it consists in converging the data from integrated bases with biometric identifiers. I mentioned some of them. To classify also consists in categorizing populations into degrees of riskiness. So if you want, who can move, who cannot? In principle, those who can move are those who do not present any risk for safety or security. Those who shouldn't move are those who, through these algorithmic operations, are recognized as presenting a risk. The idea is that, in fact, technology will allow us to sort out the world population into degrees of dangerosity. The old dream, I mean, 19th century, the poor were dangerous classes. Nowadays it's something else, but it's the same logic of sorting out, of selection and reapportionment, and of those who have to be confined in one place and those who can move freely or under certain conditions on a planet which is becoming smaller and smaller, and which is theoretically of which we are all the inhabitants. So that's the new apartheid, if you want, that is in the making through a recalibration of borders. Now, let me move towards the end. Of course, this new border regime has produced several significant spatial outcomes. We can talk about them later on. Let me just try to answer the question of why is it that the human body has human body, when I say the human body, I also mean human life. Why is it that the human body has become once again so central to the calculus of power? So, as I was arguing, new bordering and security practices have taken a keen interest in the connection between the human body and identity, as, of course, a means of achieving detailed control of a movement. All of this, the whole thing, that movement can be dangerous, so we have to control movement. And when I say movement, I also mean speed. That the two things that have to be controlled in an age of high speed and high motion, unleashed by technological innovations, are movement and speed. So, the screening of bodies at border checkpoints aims at making visible that which is hidden from view, opening up new visualizations of the unknown, potentially risky body. So here there are two ideas. One is that we know who you are if we can make your body transparent. If we can achieve a state whereby your body cannot hide anything any longer. The whole belief being that the truth of who we are is hidden in our body, inside our body. And in order to know the truth of who is whom, we have, through new technological means, to expose that body to a regime of readability, legibility, radical legibility, so as to make everything transparent to everything else, so that there is no secret any longer. So the war on secrecy, which is the equivalent of our calls for transparency, that war is going on against secrecy because secrecy is the source of danger. Then we have to know who you are and be sure that you are who you pretend to be. And that the body doesn't lie, if you want. Summarize in one word, the body doesn't lie, so we have to make it transparent to itself in order to know who is whom. Who are these people moving all around? How can we track their movements in an age when danger can emerge from anywhere? Danger in the form of a body that explodes in a cinema, in a cafe, and carries with it in its own death all kinds of people. So, to this end, the biometric technologies are supposed to fragment the human body in order to recompose it for the purpose of securitization. This is the case because the human body is seen as an indisputable anchor to which data can be safely secured. That is the reason why we are seeing the extension of the biometric border into multiple realms of social life, and in particular in the human body. So the point I'm making here is that, of course, we still have physical borders, but that the border of the future is the biometric border. It is that border we will carry with us everywhere. It is that border we will become. That we become, each of us and all taken together, borders in motion. We become borders. That is the reason why human mobility is now firmly defined as a problem of risk management. And the most efficient way to regulate mobile bodies is to turn them into portable borders. Now, let me end by adding that, of course, these technologies I have been referring to assumed to provide a complete picture of who someone is, thus leaving people having to dispute their own identity. That what the horizon is really to not turn us against ourselves, but to clarify the space of identification to a point where there is no doubt as to who we are, and we are left to, let's say, our identity is fixed and secure, secured in such a way that it becomes, our body becomes, our identity becomes a basis for prediction and prevention. Of course, all of this has profound consequences in terms of the questions such as gender, questions such as race, so forth and so on. But I think I will leave it at that, and I thank you for your attention.